Thank you everyone for joining. I am Nick Nardowitz, the State Policy Counsel at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. This panel is Protecting Religious Freedom in the States, Perspectives from State Advocates. Now, when most people think about how they can help change the country, they think about Congress. But the truth is that the real action happens in state legislatures. Not only is that where most of the lawmaking happens, it's also where you can have a real impact. Just last year, there were more than 156,000 bills introduced across the state legislatures, and 35,000 became law. Today, we'll hear from state advocates and experts that are going to talk about bills that affect the separation of religion and government. They're going to talk about some of the bills we fight and why we do that. And they'll talk about how you can do more in your state. So I'm very excited to introduce our panelists. I'm lucky to get to work with each of them, and each person has been a great ally in my work to protect church-state separation. First is Kate Miller, Advocacy Director at the ACLU of Kentucky. Kate joined the ACLU in 2008 as a program associate, and now she's the ACLU's primary lobbyist in the Kentucky General Assembly. Her emphasis is on advocacy and education related to immigrants' rights, the First Amendment, LGBT rights, justice reform, and reproductive rights, among other civil liberties. She graduated from Western Kentucky University and earned a master's in social work at the University of Louisville. Next is Samadhi Niyomchai, Manager of Public Policy at Promo, an LGBTQ advocacy organization in Missouri. Samadhi lobbies the Missouri State Legislature on behalf of Promo. He joined Promo as the Manager of Public Policy in 2019, and he came to St. Louis almost 10 years ago to get his master's in social work. Since then, he's completed his degree and obtained his clinical license in social work. And last is Lindsey Wagner, the Senior Writer and Researcher for Public School Forum of North Carolina. Lindsey provides research, analysis, and reporting on education issues in North Carolina. She has a distinguished career in education, having held positions at North Carolina Policy Watch, the American Federation of Teachers, the Institution of International Education, among others. She holds a master's degree in international education policy from the University of Maryland, College Park, and a bachelor's degree from University of Maryland, College Park in French and business. Now, before we get into the actual bills, there are just a few general questions about the work that you all do. So first, all of you work to advocate in your respective state legislatures, but it's not always clear what that looks like. So Kate, can you tell us some of the things about you do to advocate?
Absolutely. I'll mention, even though I'm our chief lobbyist, I am so privileged that we've grown, the ACLU of Kentucky has grown dramatically, that we actually have 5 folks on our advocacy team and 3 additional lobbying staff beyond myself. And that's very helpful because it provides a depth of knowledge. And most of the pieces of legislation that we work on are thoughtful, lengthy bills that provide a lot of opportunity to amend and improve upon ideas that lawmakers have. So unfortunately, that's not usually the case with the bills that I'm talking to Nick about. They're usually like a paragraph long and they're like, read the Bible in school. They're like, I don't know how to make that better. But of course, relationships are so important. Everyone that works in our state capitol understands the value of relationships with lawmakers and the importance of being able to have a trusted relationship with a lawmaker. So even a lawmaker that absolutely publicly identifies as pro-life, but doesn't perhaps see eye to eye with the agenda that's being pushed in Kentucky, will then feel comfortable talking to us about concerns that they have. So having trusted relationships with lawmakers, having trusted relationships with other lobbyists. I feel like, I mean, you all let me know how it works in your states. I imagine it's the same, but the cafeteria in the Capitol sort of feels like high school, and there's like a lot of gossip, and that gossip can be very valuable. So I think that's one really important thing. But it's easy to develop a relationship with the state lawmakers. I think you can usually find them on social media. I think people, when you're like, who's your state rep, who's your state senator, they're like, I have no idea. You know, well, they're like Mitch McConnell, and I'm like, no, he's you're people to get a hold of him. But other folks, it's pretty easy to get a hold of them, especially in Kentucky. And you all let me know if it's different in other states. Our state races are super tight. Representative Jim Glenn in Owensboro, for example, won his seat last time around by a single vote. There was an elected official, Representative Jill York, who lost 5. and that was in one election cycle. So if you get involved in campaigns for candidates that you care about, of course the ACLU is nonpartisan, we don't endorse candidates, but personally I knock on doors in campaign season, and it gives you great opportunity to build a relationship with the lawmaker that you care about, and you can sway the election. You can actually sway the election. If you knock on a couple hundred doors, that could impact the outcome of the election. So I really encourage folks, all those relationships, lawmakers, with people doing work. And if you got the money, we like to try to contract with what I call fancy lobbyists as well. Those are the people in the suits. And they can sometimes get into meetings that we can't get into. So that's the other thing that we like to do in the Kentucky General Assembly.
Great, thank you. So Kate mentioned that it's about relationships and influencing legislation, but Lindsey, what do you find to be the most effective way to advocate on the issues?
Well, thanks for having me today. I'm really excited to be with all of you. The public school forum works a little bit differently. We are a think and do tank. So we try to influence policy issues and action by way of information and education. So we do a lot of research around school finance and equity, for example. We also dive deep into transparency and accountability issues when it comes to school choice initiatives. And we, again, lift these issues up through research and reporting and information sharing with the idea that, you know, if the general public is better informed to advocate or lobby on these issues and potential solutions, that they can have an even bigger and better voice, you know, down at the state legislature. And also I would say, you know, story sharing is really key. We also have another vehicle. It's a television show that airs on our local TV station here in Raleigh, on a few other stations, and it's available on our website. And we regularly invite lawmakers to appear. And we try to ask them really tough questions while also cultivating strong relationships. But we do try to hold them to account on their voting records. And also on our television show, we invite a variety of education stakeholders to lift up their issues so that you know, the general public and lawmakers and policy makers can really be better informed on some of these issues.
Now, Samadhi, you represent the LGBTQ community in your work, and I know that Promo helps LGBTQ Missourians and their allies stay up to date on how to get involved with what's happening on the Capitol. So how important is it for legislators to hear from their constituents, including those watching this panel, in addition to hearing from organizations like ours?
It's a really great question, and similar to what Kate does in Kentucky, I'm a lobbyist for Promo, so I'm in Jeff City all the time talking to our legislators, and it's really easy for them to kind of give me a head nod or like say thanks for coming by and kind of gently shoo me out of their office. It's a lot harder for them to do that to their constituents or like someone that they actively have been elected to represent. And it's incredibly important that we, in general, talk to our legislators directly as possible. Not like, it's really easy to do a survey. It's really easy to like add your name to a letter on a website, which is still important, but it's so much more to send an email directly to that office. The number of times that I've been in the Capitol and a state rep or a state senator is like, oh, I got this email from this constituent, it's really sad. Even if it's not about LGBT issues, we still talk about it. So I always think that's very powerful when people realize that like, oh, unlike our lovely friends in the US Congress, in the state legislature, it's far more likely that your email or your phone call is going to end up going directly to that legislature. And it's so much important to put that face to a name of an issue, which we'll get into more about that later. But I may represent the LGBTQ community or like our issues in one way, but it's far different when like a trans youth is there talking about how it's their right to be able to play sports or how how medical care has saved their life, or if there's a lesbian veteran who's like, we need non-discrimination protections because I served my country and I've been denied a place to live because of my sexual orientation. Those stories, even if I were to deliver like a letter that says that story, having someone say that directly to a legislator is so much more powerful and so much more important that we engage in that somewhat intimidating, but it gets easier with time, political engagement.
Nick, if I can add to what Samadhi said, I think that's so true to like have that personal touch. I remember one, and I have heard from lawmakers before that like sometimes the way that they end up voting is strictly based on like how many, I think they're like green sheets or pink sheets. It's like yes or no votes, like calls that they get. But for the most part, I think personalized stuff is so much more valuable. And we were working on a religious liberty bill one year, and that impacted a group of Amish Kentuckians. And I think partly probably because they're Amish, they wrote handwritten letters. And I will tell you, I have never gotten so much feedback from law. And I see Lindsay nodding her head, like they were blown away to get these handwritten letters. So we started doing that more on other issues because I think to what Samadhi said, like it's much more like likely that they'll actually read it.
Yeah, that definitely all makes sense. Thank you so much for that. So let's jump into some of the bills that we've been seeing. I'm going to start with Kate. I know Kentucky passed a bill that allows public schools to offer Bible classes in 2017, and Bible class bills are a trend we've seen in other states over the past several years. The bills that have been introduced would allow or sometimes even require public schools to offer a course on the Bible. Now, courts have said that the Bible can be studied in public schools for how it relates to literature, art, music, and other similar activities. But a class focused solely on the Bible frequently leads to problems. So how has the implementation of the Bible class legislation in Kentucky worked out?
It's worked out great. There haven't been any constitutional concerns. Everything's gotcha. So we've got a couple of Bible literacy bills. Honestly, it's hard for me to keep track in Kentucky because there are so many. So Nick is super helpful because you are such an expert and you can, there's hundreds of bills filed every year. So it's helpful to have organizations like AU to provide that expertise and to flag those bills that are concerning. And so we've had a couple of Bible literacy bills. There was one that passed in 2017, I believe, and our amazing legal team did a massive open records investigation into all of the school districts. I have written down 173 school districts and asked to review the materials associated with their Bible literacy class because there hadn't been any standards developed by the state at that point. And so there were a number of very interesting examples. I'm going to provide just a couple. I know that we don't have all day, but my favorite example, actually, one of the counties played, there's a movie called God's Not Dead 2. I mean, I guess there's also God's Not Dead, the original, but the sequel is so good. I encourage you to watch the trailer. The ACLU is the villain, so get ready. But that was part of their Bible literacy course in a public school. There were definitely examples of proselytizing where they went on field trips to places or students were asking to go on field trips to places. You all might know that Kentucky has the Creation Museum, so that certainly presents an opportunity. Students were encouraged to review specific verses from the Bible to deal with anxiety that they were experiencing. They were encouraged to build close relationships with other Christians. That one really hurt to read. I know, to think of the non-Christians in that class who are going to feel excluded and left out. And one thing that I often experience when I go to different parts of the state, we'll have certain events, not to get too off topic, but we'll have little events in different counties around Kentucky, and I'm sure you all have this experience. And a lot of times our members come and they're so shocked to see 20 or 30 people at this pizza place. They're like, I thought I was the only person in my community that felt the way that I did. And I know that that can be isolating. And so I'm sure for students, and I've talked to parents in especially more rural parts of the state that have had experiences where their kids have felt left out or been bullied as a result of being a member of a minority religion. So that one really struck a chord with me. There were some classes that relied heavily on Sunday school materials and from resources from a publisher that created Sunday school materials. So there were a lot of examples of problems. We definitely weren't surprised. And there were teachers that were confused. I think we even after we did that investigation and we got some media because of it, there were teachers that reached out to us because they wanted to, they had been instructed to participate. Yeah, I think the overwhelming majority of counties didn't actually implement any of these classes, but for the places where they were implemented or where teachers were instructed to implement them, there was definitely a lot of confusion. There was a lot of guidance. There are now standards in place that the state has created, and so hopefully that will relieve us of some of these problems, but it's definitely expected to continue to be a problem.
Well, over the last several years, the legislature has passed not just one, but two bills that actually promote prayer in public schools. In 2019, they passed a bill to require the governor to declare a day of prayer for Kentucky students. And in 2017, they passed a so-called Student Religious Liberty Act that claims to clarify the rights of public school students. But first, can you just tell us what rights around religion do public school students already have?
You know how students, and it's not just when it comes to religion, but what's the quote? You don't lose your rights at the schoolhouse gate. So students have an opportunity and a right to exercise and practice their religion. Student-led activities are completely acceptable. But what we don't want is any situation in which the school looks like it's endorsing a religion. And so that's certainly what we've seen over and over again are these instances where we feel like the school is making pretty clear that they're endorsing Christianity specifically, but really, I mean, obviously it doesn't matter. Any religion that's endorsed by a public institution is going to be a problem. So of course, students have the right. And the ACLU, I say this all the time when I testify, nobody believes me, but the ACLU has a long history of representing students who have exercised their religion in a variety of settings, including in their school. And so, it's like two sides of that coin, and we're committed to providing students with the opportunity to exercise their religion as it's protected under the First Amendment.
Well, I know that we've seen a lot of these Student Religious Liberty Act bills, again, another trend over the last several years, and the bill sponsors all claim that they just want to protect the religious rights of students and free speech of students in public schools. But is that really what's going on with these bills?
I don't think so, Nick. I am suspicious. I don't know. You know, we can't get into the mind of lawmakers, and I know that there are lawmakers that feel deeply and passionately that what they're doing is right. But there are absolutely coordinated campaigns like Project Blitz that work to promote these ideologies and promote certain elements of the ideologies in order to oppress Kentuckians, to oppress LGBTQ Kentuckians, to oppress women or people who can get pregnant. It's been really hard to watch in recent years. So many of the attacks on LGBTQ folks have been attacks on kids in particular, when we think about the intersection of school and the rights of students and of trans kids. And so that's been really heartbreaking to see. And that can also be some of the most powerful testimony when we're fighting these bills are from those kids. But, you know, we have to be really careful. We don't want to put people in a place where they're going to experience trauma or be re-traumatized because of their interaction with our General Assembly. So it's another barrier for real participation from Kentuckians. But we definitely see a coordinated campaign. I was just listening to a podcast from one of our right-wing religious groups in Kentucky, trying to get a sense of what we should expect for next year. It was actually titled, it had something to do with racial justice. So it's like, oh my gosh, what if they want to work on racial justice with us? That'd be so great. But it didn't work out. I was duped.
Now, you mentioned Project Blitz, and I know that obviously these Bible class bills and these Student Religious Liberty Acts are part of Project Blitz, but can you talk more about what Project Blitz is and how that coordinated campaign you mentioned works?
Well, I saw some other folks. I saw a couple of, maybe you all would have a better sense. My sense of Project Blitz is it's a coordinated nationwide campaign, not totally dissimilar from ALEC in the sense that they provide model legislation, I believe, and that there is sort of a opportunity to advance on prior successes. So you might start with a religious liberty bill or a Bible literacy bill, and then as you build your momentum, progress into other more, even not necessarily more, but potentially more oppressive bills targeting LGBTQ folks and other individuals. Does that sound right to other? Am I leaving anything out there, Nick?
No, that sounds right to me. I mean, or it is right to me. Not sounds right to me. AU tracks Project Blitz. We have information about it on our website and all that. And yeah, you are very correct that it's this coordinated campaign that works in state legislatures, but it also seeks to work behind the scenes and, like you said, provides model bills. And again, that incremental approach. And I'd actually like to talk about one of those bills, because what Project Blitz's ultimate goal is to misuse religion to discriminate. And one of those bills that's promoted by Project Blitz, Samadhi, we've seen this trend across the last several years, where there are bills that would allow state-funded foster care agencies to use religion to justify discriminating against prospective parents on the basis of religion. And that means that a Christian agency that receives taxpayer money could refuse to work with an LGBTQ couple or turn away a Jewish couple. And in fact, AU currently represents a Catholic woman, a mom of 3, who wanted to work with children in foster care in her state of South Carolina, but was turned away by a taxpayer-funded evangelical Christian agency because she was Catholic and not evangelical. So can you tell us more, Samadhi, about why these bills are harmful?
Yeah, so at a fundamental level, like, so I'm also a social worker, right? So we know that the system is really challenging and underfunded. So ultimately, it's reducing the pool of people who are eligible to adopt children by allowing for this kind of discrimination to occur. If you say that, like, group X can't adopt kids from our agency, that means that there are more kids that are going to remain in foster care as opposed to being adopted. So on a basic level, that's bad, right? Like, if we're going to say that kids are better off in the system as opposed to with a family that is capable of loving them, providing a safe and nurturing home, that's not good. On another level, it is allowing the state via these religious organizations to say that LGBTQ families are bad parents, which is emotionally hurtful to so many people, right? Like, we have elected officials in the Capitol that are out, thankfully, and that, like, to say that they're less competent parents because their sexual orientation is a sin, like, is just, like, leaps and bounds problematic, right? Because we're not judging any other factors. Like, I'm not a Christian, so, like, would you, like, so you would say that I can't like adopt a kid either. Like, that's not why that's not why I would necessarily make a bad parent. And that's just like we said, like we talked about, like, it's really undignified to say, like, oh, these 2 gay men who want to adopt a kid aren't fit because they're gay, or like these parents, where one is transgender, one is not, are unfit parents because one of them is trans. Like, that's not okay. That's fundamentally hurtful.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic point, and especially the point about you're literally making kids who are waiting to be adopted, waiting to get into foster care, wait longer and be in situations that are, they could be with a loving family, but instead they're waiting longer. And when they're getting taxpayer funding too, it just definitely all snowballs into this terrible situation. But one of these bills was actually introduced this year in Missouri, though fortunately it didn't pass. So can you tell us about what you did to help defeat it?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, we in Missouri faced and I'm not proud of this fact, we faced down the largest number of anti-LGBTQ bills of any state in the country. The most bills that we've had to fight as an organization as well. And we also had some significant staff issues. So it was just 3 of us working against like 20 some odd bills that were coming at our community specifically. Thankfully, this one was not moving very much. And that's based on a lot of factors. One of them is that there are members of party leadership that did not want to touch this. One of the reasons being because he's also adopted. And he has said to other elected officials, like, he may not want to touch the discrimination components, but he definitely doesn't think that we should limit child, like, adoption placement options. Like, that's unacceptable. Like, placing with whoever you think is qualified. I don't care if they're gay, straight, or transgender or whatever. It's better than being stuck in the system. So that was something we went into session knowing that was an issue that ideally was not going to move forward. And to be honest, like, unfortunately, we are not, like, that's not where, fortunately and unfortunately, that's not where a lot of our anti-LGBT bills were kind of coming from this session. This year, they came after a lot of the bills targeted transgender issues, specifically trans youth, very specifically, not so much like LGB folks, which is a blessing and a curse at the same time. It's very challenging, but some other areas aren't going to progress while still going after the most vulnerable. And going into next session, we know that this might come up again, but towards the end of our session this year, we faced some weird specific gender exclusionary language in some foster care adoption bills. Basically, it was going to limit transgender kids from getting medical care and gender-related services. So we're like, okay, that's not okay. But we use that to make some pretty strong relationships with the Office of the Child Advocate, a couple of other child advocacy organizations. So we're confident that going into 2021, at least, we'll have some of those building blocks. Like, hey, if this moves, we're on the same page, right? This is bad. So we're hoping that the bill won't move, and that we can leverage our relationships with other advocates to make sure that we have a strong case that this is not good legislation.
I really like that you mentioned the relationships you built, because I think it's important to have those, especially when you work in one universe. My first instinct is to go to the people that I know, to go to people at the ACLU, to go to people at LGBT organizations, or as we'll get to with vouchers. But, a lot of times on these issues, there are other allies that we don't immediately think of they're not our immediate people. So we can think of those, the child advocates in this case are obviously people to go to, but then also working to find those unlikely allies. So it's great that you had, a Republican leader in the Missouri State Legislature who said, I am an adoptive parent and I care about this issue. So it's always helpful to try to find those people. So that's great to hear that worked out. That you expect it to come up next year and some of the things that you've done. But in addition to partnering with those other organizations, are there other things you're doing to prep for stopping this bill or other bills next year?
Definitely. We're making sure that everyone is on the same page with a lot of these issues. It was a rough couple of weeks earlier this year with a lot of the bills we were facing, so we're trying to make sure that we make sure we know where we can and cannot compromise. There are less places to compromise, and there are more places to compromise. So it's making sure we're all on the same page. So we're not going to allow banning trans girls from playing on sports teams, for example. No trans-specific sports bans, regardless of gender identity. We're not doing that today. But also continuing to build those relationships. I just got an email from some folks that testified with us against some of the medical care bans that we're going to continue building relationships with. They're fortunately very close to our state capital, so it's super helpful if we need them to come testify on anything. So just building those relationships, making sure we're all on the same page, and kind of expanding who we build those relationships with. We have a couple of out LGBT folks that are running for office this year on both sides of the aisle. That's super new. So we're definitely going to leverage those relations and kind of build unexpected allies in certain places. We do have a PAC. We're also nonpartisan, but I think we can all kind of imagine where some of the dice kind of fall, fortunately and unfortunately. So, but we know that there are Republicans that don't think that same-sex couples are bad parents and that we should say they can't adopt. That's not okay. And kind of leveraging who we can go to for those in a more unconventional manner. And we built some allies with that earlier this year. But also some folks that just don't, who consider themselves conservative, don't want to touch a lot of these issues because that's not what the government is for, and they recognize them and they see that. So that's definitely an opportunity. Oh, really? You don't want to touch adoption regulation? Well, that can expand into other areas. This is a bit of a sidestep from what we're talking about, but one Iowa beat their athlete ban by the transgender athlete ban by saying this isn't a place that the government needs to be involved in. This is high school sports is not something that requires state level legislation, which that wasn't an angle that was working for us. Our angle was like putting a face to the name of the issue, and that was very effective. But an angle that we can definitely use going into next year as well. Like, does this need to be like a state level policy? I thought we all want small government here. And kind of leveraging some of their own talking points with how legislation that targets our community doesn't really work.
And I want to point out, again, we've had someone mention this, the faces in the story, so how important those are in doing your advocacy. Okay, so shifting gears here a little bit to Lindsey. Now, private school vouchers send money to public money to private schools, which are often religious. And Americans United was actually founded to oppose private school vouchers because vouchers fund religious education, which violates our fundamental right to religious freedom. Now, the North Carolina legislature has focused on expanding private school voucher programs in the state over the last several years. And pro-voucher groups are likely to use the Supreme Court's recent decision in Espinoza versus Montana Department of Revenue to put more pressure on states to fund voucher programs. But can you tell us, what are some of the issues with private school vouchers?
Just had to unmute myself there. Yep, glad to talk about this issue. This is a big one for us. Our chief concern with North Carolina's voucher program is both the overall lack of transparency and accountability with how the program is run and how those dollars are allocated. But also, of course, the fact that private voucher schools can discriminate in a lot of different ways. So I'll talk a little bit about the accountability piece first. So I think somewhere around 2/3, possibly higher, of North Carolina's private schools are religious, and the vast majority of dollars, private voucher dollars, go to religious schools. So I wanted to make that clear from the outset. And then when we also say that they're unaccountable, we're talking about how they don't really have to meet any meaningful state-approved academic standards like our public schools do. They don't have to make their budgets public. They don't have to adhere to open meetings and records laws. And for the most part, they don't have to publicly report student achievement, with some small exceptions. They do have to comply with some health and safety regulations and some anti-discrimination laws, but overall, the expectations for private schools are pretty lax in North Carolina. I did some reporting on our state's largest voucher school in Fayetteville, North Carolina, called Trinity Christian School. That school has taken in, over the past 5 or so years, the voucher program's only been around since about 2014. They've taken in several million public school dollars, and they're primarily funded with public dollars despite being private. During my reporting, I learned that the school's basketball coach, who was also the son of the head of school there and kept the school's financial books, pled guilty and went to jail a few years ago for embezzling hundreds of thousands of tax withholding dollars he collected over 8 years from the school's employees. Despite this, and having received a jail sentence that he completed on the weekends, he was able to continue his employment at the school and continue coaching basketball. The school is known for sending high-profile athletes to the NCAA, even the NBA, but it's also known anecdotally for providing a poor education to largely low-income students. This was a pretty big scandal in North Carolina, but it did not motivate the General Assembly to enact any laws that would tighten standards around private schools receiving public money. And of course, all of this is to say Trinity Christian School is a religious school. It's not clear the degree to which they ask students to profess their faith in terms of Christianity. A lot of private Christian schools do that in North Carolina. In their handbooks, in their admissions policies, they ask families and students to make it very clear that they've accepted Jesus Christ as their savior in order to be admitted to the school. So it's possible that this school also demanded that sort of allegiance. And so that's just one example of many private schools that receive public dollars here. Also, I want to touch on a question around academic results. And in North Carolina, the state legislature mandates so little in terms of student data and performance on standardized tests that it's really impossible to discern whether or not private voucher students are doing any better than their public school counterparts. There's just not enough information.
I will say, we know that nationally there are studies of other voucher programs in other states, and a lot of them have found that students actually perform worse after receiving a voucher. They either show no improvement or perform worse, even though we're sending all of this money to private schools that, as you said, have no accountability, don't know where the money is spent,
Right.
Or states that just don't collect data. And so that has always truly boggled my mind, that we send all this money there with just no accountability and no way to measure this. Or when we do measure it, when it is measured, find that it's not working and it's not doing what the legislatures have been saying it's supposed to do.
Yep.
So I'm glad that you mentioned the discrimination piece, because private schools can and often do discriminate against students on the basis of religion, as you mentioned, with the statements of faith, or against specifically against LGBTQ students and families by denying admission or expelling students. And I know that in 2016, the North Carolina Policy Watch found that voucher schools were discriminating against LGBTQ students or had explicit anti-LGBTQ policies. And in July of this year, a group of parents, including several same-sex couples, filed a lawsuit against the voucher program because they can't find a school that will accept them. So how else do private schools discriminate against prospective students?
Well, like I mentioned, a lot of them have handbooks online that you can go to different private Christian schools across North Carolina and look up their handbooks and look up their admissions policies and find that if you do not profess allegiance to or acceptance of Jesus Christ, you won't be admitted to the school. If you are LGBTQ or even have a family member who is LGBTQ, that disqualifies you from admission to the school. A lot of times students with disabilities are counseled out of even applying to the school because they cite they just don't have the resources to accommodate those students. Keep in mind that public schools are all required to accept everyone, no matter what their faith is or a potential disability. Another way in which private voucher schools can discriminate is the voucher amount here in North Carolina is only $4,200 for the entire year. And most low-income students really cannot, this is a voucher program that is targeted toward low-income students. They can't really access high-quality education with just $4,200 a year. Most private schools that are high quality, the tuition is far higher than that. So I'm finding in my research that those who do take advantage of these vouchers are going to schools that are, in churches that might be of questionable quality, and they charge around the same amount as the voucher so that they can get that funding stream. So, it's our position that taxpayer dollars should never be used to fund discrimination, and they should be used exclusively for public schools. I mean, that's really in our state constitution that public funds should go to public schools. There has been some creative work on the part of our legislature to make it so that public dollars go to the families that then quickly endorse them over to private schools to sort of get around that constitutional piece. But that's chiefly how voucher schools discriminate.
Now, we've talked a lot about the problems with the voucher program, but how do vouchers affect public schools?
So when a student opts out of the public school system and takes a publicly funded voucher, the public schools in North Carolina are a little bit different than a lot of other states in that they are primarily funded by the state versus local taxation base. So they're based on it. The funding is based on enrollment. So when a student leaves the school system to go to a private school, that per pupil funding amount leaves the public school system. But it's not sort of a one-to-one thing. I mean, when a student leaves the system, it's not like correlating costs go down at the same time. You still got to pay the lights. You still got to keep the building maintained. You still need a certain number of teachers. So it really hurts local districts' ability to provide an equitable education for everyone the more and more that students opt out of the public schools. I'm also concerned, of course, with COVID right now. We are all very concerned that as we move into a remote learning environment, that's very challenging for working families to navigate. A lot of folks are going to opt out of public schools and look at private options and quickly realize there is a state-funded private voucher program that they may advocate to be available to them, even if they're not a low-income family. And we've known for a long time that the intent of lawmakers was always to open up the voucher program, not just to low-income families, but really to everyone. And so we're worried that that legislation might be coming soon. So that's really how vouchers affect public schools. They divert badly needed money out of the system. And schools in North Carolina are already very much underfunded, which has been found over and over through a lawsuit known as Leandro that has found that we have not been equitably and adequately serving public school students in this state for decades.
Well, I know that we will be there in the fight with you to fight any of those attempted expansions. I want to thank you all for joining us. Any last minute thoughts anyone has? Something that popped up in anyone's head that they want to add to the conversation?
I mean, that story, Lindsay, it's just wild. Okay, embezzling all that money and he's still, so that's wild. And that's a helpful, I've been thinking like, what should we expect for this year? Like obviously with the pandemic and like that increased potential for vouchers is a helpful thing for us to think about.
Yeah.
Okay, well, again, thank you all for joining to my panelists. Thank you to those of you who are watching. We appreciate your joining us and your support. And I look forward to working with all my panelists, and I hope that everyone has an absolutely wonderful rest of their day.
Thank you.